Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Karen Yarhimilo. I'm the Dean of SIPA and the Adlai E. Stevenson of International and Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us for today's Rapid Response webinar on Iran, hosted by the Institute of Global Politics. Now, while much of the world's attention this week has been focused on conversations in Davos and debates over Greenland, today's discussions remains urgent and consequential. The past several weeks have underscored just how volatile and complex this moment is for the people of Iran, for the wider Middle East, the United States national security, and for the broader international system. Protests in Iran that began over economic hardship and political frustration have been met with the deadliest nationwide crackdown in Iran in decades. Independent estimates as of now suggest fatalities in the thousands, though communication blockouts and severe restrictions continue to obscure the full human toll. Now, at the same time, tensions between Tehran and Washington have shifted back and forth between confrontation and restraint. President Trump has issued sharp warnings about further violence against protests, and most recently commented publicly on the possibility of U.S. military action, but also signaling that the Iranian leaders may be open to talks. These mixed signals have fueled uncertainty, to say the least, about U.S. intentions and strategies, both within the region and in Washington. Regional governments have urged caution, concerned about escalation and unintended consequences, while Iranian officials have warned that any external attack would trigger severe retaliation. So, taken together with the last year's strike on Iran nuclear facilities and the broader regional war in the Middle East involving several of Iran's proxies, this moment really reveals that the regime is under significant strain, internally brittle and externally challenged. So today's discussion, we will focus largely on what comes next and what this moment reveals for popular discontent inside Iran, about U.S. coercive diplomacy and the balance of power across the Middle East. We will examine four larger themes. First, we will focus on the human dimension, the cost of the protests, and the brutal crackdown, and where this opposition movement may go from here. Second, we will look at U.S. national security policy towards Iran and discuss, obviously, if President Trump chooses to intervene and launch an attack or attempt a regime change, what would be reasonable or what would be even desirable, what outcomes are realistically achievable, what costs would be acceptable, and how should we really think about success. Third, we will discuss Iran's economic situation, whether sanctions are working, including how external actors might use this moment to exert greater leverage. And then we will step back and ask several critical questions, not just about what comes next and what success look like, but really looking at the global geopolitical chessboard. How are we thinking about U.S. decision makers wrestling with what's happening in Iran in the context of whatever, given everything else that is going on at the same time. So lots to cover today and lots to talk about. We are really privileged, extremely privileged, to be joined by a panel that brings together deep expertise across security, diplomacy, regional politics. We have with us, who will actually join us shortly, Amos Hochstein is a recognized global energy expert, senior negotiator, and business executive with more than 2 decades of experience in the White House, State Department, and Capitol Hill, including serving as the lead U.S. negotiator in brokering the 2024 ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. And we are really fortunate to have him as an IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellow with us this year. We have Mark Dubowitz, is the chief executive of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the leading experts on Iran's nuclear program and global threat network. He's advising U.S. lawmakers and administrations across party lines. And We have also with us Kian Tajbakhsh. He's the he's an Iranian-American scholar and social scientist who follows Iran's opposition and domestic dynamics closely for years. He himself was arrested and detained in Iran on national security charges and was released in 2016. He's now a presidential fellow and lecturer at Columbia University Committee on Global Thought and an adjunct professor here at Columbia SIPA. The discussion today will be moderated by our own ambassador, Victoria Newland. Victoria is the Shelby Cullum Davis Professor in the Practice of International Diplomacy. She's the director of SIPA's International Fellows Program. Over a 35-year career, she has served 6 U.S. presidents and 10 secretaries of states from both parties. Most recently, she was acting deputy secretary of state and undersecretary for political affairs from 2023 to 2024. Thank you so much for the panelists for being with us, for you, the audience, for tuning in, and Toria for moderating it. The floor is yours. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, panelists, for being with us, and thank you, audience, for tuning in. As Karen said, Amos Hochstein will join us in a little bit, but why don't we kick it off with Kian? Can you, Kian, just set the stage for us? What happened and why? Do you consider these protests different than the waves of protests that have been going on since 2011 that have been put down summarily by the regime in different ways? What's the current situation on the ground, particularly in the context of the human dimension and the massive killings of protesters and arrests that we've seen? And has the regime done what it is now saying it has done, which is to crush this? Sedition is over, said the prosecutor general yesterday. Give us a sense of how significant this was. Is it over? And how are the Iranian people navigating?
Well, thank you very much, Victoria, and I'd like to extend my thanks to SIPA and its dean, Karen, for bringing together this panel to shed an important light on a very important topic, both for the Iranian people and for U.S. foreign policy. And I think it's a topic that all students should be following carefully. To your first question about how these protests began and how they are different from prior protests in Iran, it's important to say that they both have continuity and something very different. Let's start with the continuity. First of all, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was established in 1979 as a result of the Iranian Revolution, which toppled the Shah and brought into being the first theocratic regime, full theocratic regime probably in the world, has faced cascading protests and opposition ever since it began. But if we go back to about 1999, what we see is a series of protests that emerged in different sectors of society and brought in different population groups. So in 1999, we saw the first student uprising in Iran, which was then crushed. That was followed 10 years later in 2009, 2 years before the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square, in which the Green Movement, some of your listeners may remember in 2009, there was a huge protest in Iran contesting what many believed were the fraudulent election of then the Holocaust-denying controversial President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Unfortunately, in 2009, I was arrested along with thousands of other pro-democracy activists and human rights activists, and even many ordinary people who protested and demanded greater accountability and transparency in the political system. That was also crushed. And we then fast forward to about 2018 and 19, and several years ago, a number of economically focused protests emerged as a result of cost of living, collapsing currency in Iran, and other mismanagement throughout the country. These were in rural areas and in urban areas. Then what we see is in 2022, probably the most important protest emerging amongst young women in Iran, with male supporters and other middle class supporters, in what is now well known as the Woman Life Freedom movement. This I have written about as the first feminist uprising in Iran, not the first time the feminist movement has been active, but the first frontal assault by young women against the Islamic morality police and the strict laws of gender apartheid under which the Islamic Republic rules women in their country. Now, so you can see, before we get to here, let me just review quickly. We started with students who were protesting freedom of speech. Then in the Green Movement in 2009, we had a huge swath of the population protesting for greater political transparency and accountability. Then in 2018 and 19, we had rural and urban working class people protesting economic mismanagement and economic injustice. Then in 2022, we had young women protesting gender apartheid and gender equality. And what you found this year in the last month was triggered in the short term by a massive collapse of the Iranian rial, which made a part of the commercial merchant bazaar bankrupt because they were no longer able to import electronic goods, mostly to begin with. But this economic protest a few weeks ago immediately triggered what I could say is a combination of all those protests before, and a massive outpouring of anger, resentment, many amongst young people who are unemployed, many young men who feel pressure in being able to have both a free life and also have economic prosperity and opportunity. This burst onto the scene. And so what you can see, there is both continuation in the sense that this is just simply a cascading set of grievances across a set of dimensions that the Islamic Republic, which is really a theocratic dictatorship, has suppressed and stamped down in all areas of life. And this burst on the scene, and it immediately turned into a regime-threatening set of demands. In other words, demands for the collapse and the overthrow of the regime amongst, I'm sure, a great portion of the protesters. This, unfortunately, even though there was a sort of new level of demand, even for the first time, a sector of the protesters articulated a support for Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah. So the monarchist group were being in the streets for the first time also, amongst many other groups. But unfortunately, what we saw is last Friday and last Saturday, the regime for the first time, and this is unfortunately also what is a discontinuous from the past, even though there had been brutal, mortal crackdown, particularly in 2018 and 19, but this time the regime took off the gloves and they decided that they would crack down with no mercy. And because we are experiencing North Korea levels of internet blackout and communication blackout in a country, students and listeners should be aware, this is a country bigger than Germany, France, and Italy combined. It has more than 90 million people. And imagine just throwing off the kill switch of disconnecting the country from the outside world. So we don't have a lot of information about what's going on. But the latest estimates are something above perhaps 5,000 killed in just 2 days, in which the army was unleashed and was told to shoot, to kill anyone who was in the streets, according to reports that we've heard. Not just protesters, but anyone who was in the streets, and many people have been reported killed. So unfortunately, I think we are, in response to your question, has it been crushed for now? I would say that yes, in the short term, it has been crushed with overwhelming, brutal force. But as my review of the history, I think, indicated, these are grievances that are not going to go away, because these are problems of social freedom, economic opportunity, political accountability and transparency, and a whole range of other grievances. These are not problems that the Islamic Republic wants to solve, even recognizes that they are problems to solve. And so this is going to create more grievances in the future. It's hard to predict when, but I think that unfortunately we will see protests coming up in the future. And at the moment, the government seems absolutely committed to murder and kill many of their own compatriots, their own civilians, to stay in power. I'd be happy to speak about other mechanisms, but I think I would like to go on to another question.
Thanks, and thank you for that, Kian. And welcome to Amos Hochstein, who has now joined us. And as you say, grievances upon grievances over the decades. And of course, as information spreads across Iran about the level of brutality and the depth of brutality of the regime's response, that will add further fuel to the fire, although none of us can predict where it's going. Let me go to Mark. Mark, President Trump appears to see an opportunity here. He has given himself a number of options, including moving a carrier strike group into the region. We have considerable economic pressure, which we'll come to already on Iran, but there are more measures that could be taken. He's talked about supporting the protesters. He's also increasingly talking again about the need for a change of regime. If he were to call you up and say, Mark, what's the best move now? Where would you be on that subject? What do you think the U.S. interests are here? Is there an opportunity given the weakness of the regime? And if we do put our hands directly on this problem again, what are the implications? What kind of an aftermath would we have to manage? U.S. interests enhanced or hurt by getting ourselves into it directly?
Great. Well, thanks, Victoria. Thank you, Karen. And great to be on a panel with Kian and Amos. So let me start where Kian ended, and that is, I think the history of the Iranian protest movement is critical to understand, both from an Iranian perspective and an American perspective. The American perspective, we haven't covered ourselves in glory, because in all those stages of protests and all those phases, the late 1990s, 2009, 2018-19, 2022-23, four American administrations did very little to support the Iranian people. And it's just a reality. We tried, there was some rhetoric, there were some things done technically, but we really were not there in any fundamental way to support Iranian protesters. And now we come to this round of protests, and a fifth administration has done something that is unprecedented, which I think President Trump has really put American credibility and American power and American promises behind Iranian protesters. And he's done that in a really quite a remarkable, unprecedented way. I mean, his rhetoric has been essentially endorsing regime change. He's talked about a change in leadership. He asked Iranians to take over their institutions, and he promised that America would have their back. In the meantime, the numbers I'm seeing, Kian, I hope you're right, and the numbers I'm seeing are wrong, but there's new UN estimates and other estimates that are coming out that suggest over 20,000 Iranians have been killed. over 30,000, 40,000 have been arrested. And as President Trump noted, there were hundreds, over 800 that were lined up to be executed, and I'm sure many, many more. So the scale of the slaughter, as Kian mentioned, is unprecedented. And the commitment of an American president is unprecedented. So I'm absolutely would say to President Trump, you have made a commitment. You've drawn an American red line. You've put our credibility on the line. This has serious consequences if you don't enforce it. Not only how this will play out with respect to Iran and the commitment we made to the Iranian people, some of the most pro-American people on the planet, if we don't actually back that up with some kind of serious action, we're going to lose the Iranian people. And we're also going to lose credibility with respect to our allies and adversaries around the world. So, Mr. President, you've put yourself on the line. You've put the United States on the line. You need to follow through. What does follow through mean? Well, what it means is it means an expansion of the president's three pillars of his Iran strategy. One is maximum pressure, which really dates back to the first Trump administration, which for the most part has been economic pressure, serious financial pressure against the regime. The other pillar is maximum support. Are we going to actually provide maximum support to the Iranian people, and what does that mean? And then a third pillar, which I think is really emerging as a result of this round of protests, which is maximum fracturing. How do we actually intensify the pre-existing fractures within the revolutionary elite and within the security services? They seem to have held and cohered in the last week and a half. The security services seem to have stood by the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. I prefer to call him the extreme leader than the supreme leader. And it seems like the, quote, reformists, to the extent they ever existed, and the so-called hardliners have also cohered and have agreed that a massive crackdown of Iranians was required. But I believe, and I'd be interested to hear from Kian, that there are actually fractures within the revolutionary elite that we need to intensify, we need to exploit, because I think that will lead to some of the conversation we're going to have about how do you actually get rid of this regime. But President Trump has effectively put American credibility behind regime change. So what would I advise him to do? Well, the first thing is I think he is starting to move in quite a significant way military forces into the region. The USS Lincoln, the carrier strike group, is a couple days away from being in the in CENTCOM's area of responsibility and close to Iran. And that brings tremendous American firepower. And obviously, we have our bases in the region. We've been moving F-15s increasingly to Jordan. We're starting to amass a required amount of American military power so that President Trump can deliver on what he has asked his commanders and policymakers for, which is some decisive options. I think his decision not to move 2 weeks ago had something to do with the fact that he didn't have all of the required military assets in the region to respond to any kind of Iranian retaliation. I also think the Israelis were asking him to make sure that on any kind of massive retaliation, the United States can be there, as it was in June of last year. Our Gulf allies, I think the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Omanis have been lobbying him not to do anything because I think they're also afraid of any kind of retaliation. So with that in mind, what are the military options? Well, things that I would advise the president to do is, number one, the most dangerous strategic military asset that the IRGC has left today are their missile program, is their ballistic missile program. And it is only a matter of time before the Israelis go back in and finish the job that they didn't complete in June of last year, which is to try to destroy that strategic missile program. Since it's inevitable, the Israelis are going to go in, and we are going to be implicated in that anyway. I think the United States should do the job. We have much more capabilities than the Israelis. We have the B-2s, the massive ordnance penetrators that could really destroy those deeply buried, particularly ballistic missile sites and capabilities and inventory. So the first thing that I recommend he hit the strategic missile capabilities. The second is on the nuclear side. We've done serious damage to the nuclear program, but the Iranians are building something called Pickaxe Mountain in Natanz, which will be ultimately an enrichment site and a centrifuge manufacturing facility. They'll go much deeper than the Fordo facility that I'm sure many of you heard about during the June War. And to the extent that this is going even deeper and going to be even more hardened, we should take that out before it's completed. The third is we should take out the IRGC Navy, hit them preemptively, and go after fixed launch sites to limit or to mitigate the retaliatory ability of the IRGC against US forces, against our Gulf allies, and against Israel. And then, the fighters can be up in the skies, taking out missiles and drones. And at that point, the Israelis may join, may not join. That's really the nuclear strategic missile piece of this. And it's clearly in US interest that we destroy as much of that capability as possible. The second piece of this is leadership. I think it's very important. And here there's a set of options. The most extreme option would be kill Ali Khamenei, the extreme leader. Take him out. And after taking him out, send a very clear message to the remaining security apparatus and leadership that they have a choice. Either they stop the repression, end the terrorism, end their nuclear program, and end their missile program, or we're going to hit them next. And that's got to be a clear and unambiguous threat. We can talk about the wisdom of taking out Khamenei, but I think that would be symbolically important. And I think it would certainly embolden the Iranians who have been the target of Khamenei's massacres for so many years. And it may be that if you're going to do that, you take out the senior commanders of the IGC, the Ministry of Intelligence, the Basij, similar to what the Israelis did in June of last year. So those would be my recommendations. Certainly heavy on economic pressure, heavy on diplomatic pressure. I think the Europeans, I think they're all obviously obsessed with what's going on in Greenland, rightly so. But it's shameful that at this point, the European Union hasn't designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization. And at this point, Spain and Italy and France are blocking that. All other European countries have agreed to an IRGC designation. Europeans should also expel all Islamic Republic diplomats from their capitals and should pull their ambassadors. Most of those ambassadors in European capitals are working for the IRGC or the Ministry of Intelligence. They are spies, they are not diplomats, and that would be a clear indication, not only our distaste, but a way to politically isolate the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I'll end there.
Thanks for that, Mark. That's a very robust set of options. I mean, essentially what you're recommending is taking this moment of popular uprising and crushing and reputational damage to Iran and using it, converting it into finishing the nuclear and missile decapitation of the regime and perhaps the regime altogether. That begs the question, what comes next and what happens on the street and who manages this vast country and how are we sure that it is better afterwards? And the old Pottery Barn, you break it, you own it. Amos, can you react to Mark's policy recommendations? He also is giving the US a huge amount of credit for being able to do all these things effectively. Where would you be in what should be done now? And do you think that Israel and the Gulfies were urging caution simply because they didn't think we were ready to help protect them from retaliation, or because they too worry that we're not ready for what happens next?
Thanks, Toria, and it's great to be here with Mark and Kian and Karen, and thanks for doing this. Look, I think there's a few questions. One, Iran, we all can agree, I think everybody around the world should be agreeing that the brutal repression of what they did, the massacre that they committed against the Iranian people is just horrific, and there needs to be a response. But I think that a few things happened. One, I think when you move so many of our military assets, remember, we had the military capability in place a month ago or 6 weeks ago. It was moved to the Caribbean in order to be able to threaten Maduro, former leader, now deposed, of Venezuela. And so one is the lesson for us in this crisis that the US military can't be everywhere all the time, and there are consequences, and you got to make choices. Because here something happened, and to Mark's point, we did not have the tools available to us at the moment that we actually needed them. Today, we're already 2 weeks later, and both Kian and Mark alluded to it. The protests really got, there haven't been much protests since last Saturday, and so, or a week and a half ago. So we're already a little late to this event. I think the problem is that Iran is, we have to learn lessons from where we tend to say we can just do regime change by airstrikes. And so the question to me is, can we strike Iran? Of course we can. And we can do all the things that Mark said we can do. But despite the fact that there's been a lot more, as Kian talked about, more monarchists on the streets, it's not clear that the monarchists and Pahlavi is seen in Iran as a viable option acceptable to the Iranian people. So now you talk about airstrikes and you say, okay, for the purpose of what? If it's for the purpose of punishing the Iranian leadership, okay, you can do certain strikes. It's usually better to do them at the time of the massacre, not weeks later. But and I believe that it is possible that we're going to do them in the coming days. But that doesn't do regime change. If you want to take out, as to use the words of Mark, take out the supreme leader or others, we are not going to be putting American boots on the ground. And there are no other boots on the ground to come in. And therefore, the idea that we do regime change by remote control with just repeated airstrikes, to me is dangerous, because I don't know what comes next. And here I want to note saying that Kian talked about the military got the order and they went and did it. Let's not take that for granted. In Tahrir Square, the Mubarak folks gave an order to shoot protesters, and the police and the army refused. These were their neighbors. In Iran, they did not refuse, and they committed a massacre. Nobody had a problem. So I don't see the cracks that people are talking about inside the regime. We haven't seen it. I hear talk of it, but I haven't seen evidence of it. So I agree with Mark that there was a policy of maximum pressure. I just disagree with Mark that there was any implementation of maximum pressure in the Trump administration against Iran. Iran has been actually exporting more oil in the last year than they have in over a decade. And they've actually produced more. Their production of energy has increased to probably the highest ever. So I think that we have to look at this as a more comprehensive approach of, if you take strikes, you can take out the missiles and weaken the regime. But I would worry about a regime change policy by airstrikes. And I think we should once again tighten the screws economically in order to put more pressure and support of the protesters and encourage the people to rise up again in order to replace the regime from within, not from without. So again, Mark said this before, I think that the Obama administration missed an opportunity in the Green Revolution, without a doubt. I think it did not understand the enormity of the moment. I think we may have missed an opportunity here again. But I don't think that chapter is closed. I think we have to not allow the world and the regime to be able to walk away from their oppressive putting down of the protest of last week. And there has to be that response.
So some agreement and some concern here. You could see from this conversation a policy in which you increase the economic pressure, trying to dry up the oil supply more, taking some strategic strikes, whether it's in punishment or whether it's to encourage the folks on the ground. The question then becomes, were the Iranian people simultaneously to take those opportunities to go out into the streets again? And were the regime to begin to crack? What does that look like? What kind of support would they need? Are we actually ready for an indigenous, non-autocratic, violent alternative? What kind of international support, US support would they need for that? What about the Shah? And then a question from our listeners, many are asking whether the Army and the IRGC would split. almost made a version of the point that you've got a whole sector of Iranian society in the security services. So they're going to worry about their future. So how do you get to a better Iran with these potential pressures that both guys have recommended?
I'd like to make a couple of comments. I'll respond to that, and then I'll make a couple of comments on the idea of what U.S. foreign policy might do. First of all, I'd say that in terms of what we see, I think it's important for people to understand a little bit about the makeup of the Iranian society and what makes it perhaps different from the way Amos was suggesting to other countries in the Middle East, like Egypt during Tahrir Square. First of all, I have been working and living in Iran for the last 20 odd years, um, and I've been studying it for over 2 decades. And one of the things that is remarkable, and many people throughout the world who study revolutions are waiting for revolutions to lose their steam and to lose their aggressive ideological utopian ideas. And it's referred to sometimes as Thermidor, that is to say, the time after the French Revolution of 1789, when the revolutionaries, became functionaries of the state. They became involved in administration, and they kind of toned down and began to settle down into the reconstruction of a new society. It is remarkable that the core of the regime in Iran, and I think should not be underestimated, that there is a remarkably, astonishingly high degree of cohesion and ideological commitment to the core of the regime. Now, when I say the core of the regime, what are we talking about? Remember, Iran has about 90 million population. That means an adult population of perhaps 60 to 65 million. 10% of that, we estimate, 10 to 15% we may designate as the hardcore ideological base of the regime. That is to say, if given a chance in some elections, and these are some of the indications we use, when there is a very, very far hardline pro-supreme leader candidate, as opposed to another clerical type of slightly more reform candidate, we have 5 or 6 million or 7 million people who will vote for that supreme candidate, for the supreme leader backed candidate. Now, let's take 10% of the population as being ideologically core. And I know them. I mean, you see them in Iran, you talk to them occasionally, and they are true believers. That is to say that they will put their life for that cause, as far as we can tell. Another 10% of the population are maybe not ideological core believers, but their livelihoods depend on the regime. They depend on the regime in a very straightforward, direct way. They are employed by the regime. They're employed by the security services. Now you're up to 20% of the population. Now, on the other end, consider maybe 20% of the population, like many countries in the world, don't care about politics. They have nothing. They don't follow it at all. They are disaffected and they don't follow it. That's already 40%. Then you have another 20%, which we see in terms of 15, 20% we see in our data, who participate in public life and in elections, for example, but have no particular ideological focus or commitment. That is to say, they are flexible. They move around. They vote for a hardline candidate in one election, and then a reformist candidate in another, and don't vote in another. That leaves 15, 20% who always support the reformist candidate. So I just went through that to say that when we talk about a country as big as Iran and as complex as Iran, we should keep in mind these different groups. And again, to emphasize that we should not underestimate the ideological core of the regime. I do remember several years ago, after I got out of prison, and this is one thing that after being in prison, I'm not thankful for the experience. I would have rather not had that experience. But one of the things I did when I came out, and having spent over years being interrogated by senior IRGC officers. You know, you look them in the eye when you do see them, when you're not blindfolded, but you can look them in the eye, hear their voice, and I came away thinking, okay, these people are really serious. Years ago, Iran watchers would say, you know, the IRGC are like a group of mafia, and what they all they really want is to get fat through government contracts. And I said, you know, I don't think so. Wait until the body bags start coming back from Syria, and then you'll see. And when the body bags, the IRGC soldiers started coming back from Syria, I said, well, you know, that group is really committed to this enough to put their life on the line. So I think there is this complexity to Iran, but there is also, we shouldn't underestimate the core of the regime. And you know, for an academic institution, let me tell you, after decades of my life studying political science, if someone said to me, what is the one big thing you learned, one big truth that the science of politics teaches you? I will really take away one thing, and that is organized minorities are more powerful than disorganized majorities. And that's what explains how a small minority of 10 million people or 15 million people can rule and control a country of 90 million. Let me go to the question of the fracture that Mark asked about and ask about, is there a way to create a fracture in this elite? And here I want to just segue and conclude my remarks with a few points about U.S. foreign policy. I would say that what we should be doing is we should look for the best overlap between U.S. foreign policy national interests and Western, I would say, if Europe gets its act together and also supports the U.S., what is in the there is an overlap, a kind of sweet spot, I suppose. There's nothing sweet about this whole issue. There's an overlap between what is in the U.S. national interest and what is in the interest of the democracy agenda inside Iran. Now, I think that what the U.S. can do from the outside is not strengthen the movement inside. It's very hard to impact or build up the movement from inside, but it can weaken the repressive apparatus from outside. And Mark mentioned a couple of these, and I would say there are three really kind of places: people, money, and weapons, where the U.S. can target to weaken the regime. Mark has spoken about weapons. Amos has spoken about the money. The fact that Iran is exporting 2 million barrels of oil or pumping 2 million barrels of oil and exporting this to China may fit, actually, the Trump administration's larger geopolitical strategy in terms of, and I'll defer to Amos to discuss this, but for example, I understand even the tankers that were impounded from Venezuela, those tankers that were aimed towards China were let through. Now, if the Trump administration is aiming to pursue the long-term geopolitical strategy, which I think is not unreasonable, which is to push China into greater economic relationship with the United States and lessen and weaken its military challenge to the United States, that makes sense. But then it's a choice to make in terms of the Iranian regime, because if they have access to that export of oil, the Iranian regime has the money to build up its capacity to repress its society. In terms of people, I would say from the outside, pressuring the people, again, the question of fracturing the money, it's been many decades that Iranian opposition outside of Iran has called on the American administration, Canadian and European administrations to go after the families of senior Iranian diplomats and government officials who repress their people at home but send their children to be educated in the West and send their assets to the West. I don't know whether this would lead to a fracture or defections in the regime, but certainly it's the case that we're giving them a free ride if they're allowed to move their assets here into Iran, outside of Iran. Your question, Victoria, about is there a fracture Do we see a fracture between the IRGC and the Artesh, the traditional army? Unfortunately, not really.
Yeah.
The Artesh has been fully indoctrinated into the same ideological, more or less into the same ideological command structure as the IRGC. So I think those are some of the pressure points that I would point to and some of the challenges that remain.
Thanks. Mark, just coming back to you. I think the concern here is that we can do all these things, and then you can set off a deep and intense civil war in Iran that either we engage ourselves in directly, and what would that look like? Or the Iranian people have to fight it out. I remember when Gaddafi went down, and many people were talking about the fact that the Libyan people had been in a political coma for 40 years. The political coma is obviously much longer and deeper in Iran. So do you see a way to foster a group of people who could actually at least hold the security situation on the ground such that you could get to an election, you could get to indigenous leaders, you could get to a more democratic Iran quickly for you, and then coming back to Amos? And if not, are we in sort of a medium term, longer game where we're going to punish them, we're going to squeeze them, and we're going to encourage the population to begin to develop alternatives for the moment when it can move?
So, I mean, I think President Trump's mental model, and you heard him say this a few days ago when he was asked about Venezuela. You know, why did you decapitate Maduro, but you left in place the Maduro regime? And he said, remember Iraq. And we took down Iraq, and then we got ISIS. I think that was a sort of direct quote. I think his mental model, as he looks at Iran, is similar. I mean, I think, again, forget about what I think we should do or ought to do, but I think what President Trump is more likely to do is, if he uses American military power in some kind of meaningful way, is to go after serious strategic assets of the regime. Again, missiles, nuclear, potentially some kind of strike on the IRGC, and then come out and say, all right, you've seen what I can do. I don't bluff. I enforce red lines, and let's make a deal. Let's make a deal. Who in the IRGC is going to step up, and we're going to retain the bureaucracy. We're going to retain the infrastructure. We're going to effectively retain the regime. But I want to change, not of regime, but a change of behavior. And if you don't change your behavior, well, then there's going to be more pain that you're going to feel. I think in Trump's sort of mental model, you could see that being more likely. The second thing I would just say is that, you know, I always worry about escalation. Obviously, we all should. I think the Israelis demonstrated against Iran that decades of conventional wisdom in Washington were wrong, that the Israelis achieved escalation dominance, not just against Iran's proxies, but against the Islamic Republic itself. And I think the 12-day war was an excellent example of the Israeli military and intelligence community's ability to have that kind of escalation dominance and open up the skies for US B-2s to take out Fordo and finish the job on Natanz and Isfahan. So again, conventional wisdom on Iran, many decades. We all sat through many war plans and planning exercises. I'm sure you, Victoria, you sat through many more than I did. And it was always the view that this was going to escalate into World War III or into a major regional conflagration. I think the Israelis demonstrated that that didn't take place. Doesn't mean it won't take place, but it didn't. And third, really quickly, and I think Kian is the expert on this, and fascinating to listen to him. Look, Iran is not Syria. It's not Libya. It's not Egypt. You know, first of all, the majority of Iranians are not Islamists, right? They are secular, and they are secularizing at a rapid pace. We don't have an ethnic minority problem in the sense that we've got ethnic minorities that support the regime and ethnic minorities that oppose the regime, and we're going to end up in a civil war between Persians, Kurds, Baluchis, and Arabs. The vast majority of those people are on the 80% side that Kian mentioned. They despise this regime. And I think the brutal slaughter of Iranians has changed the dynamic inside the regime and may have even affected Kian's numbers. Because I think because it's unprecedented, I think many more people are horrified. Those who were probably uninterested in politics have become a lot more interested in getting rid of this regime. Those who opposed the regime from their balconies were now on the streets. Those who were on the streets in the past were on the streets in much greater numbers and have faced a much greater slaughter. And I think even inside the 20% support base of the regime, remember, this whole protest was triggered by the Bazaris. As Kian said, the Bazaris were traditionally, historically, a strong supporter of the regime for economic reasons. They were the ones who actually triggered these protests in the first place. So we may see a reordering of the constellation of forces within the regime support base.
So, Amos, where are you? And we're running out of time. Last word for you quickly, and then a last word for Kian in the 4 minutes that we have. Do you find yourself as optimistic as Mark that if things, with increased pressure militarily, economically, a new generation of Iranians can take control of their own fate? Or do you worry that it gets a lot worse on the ground before it gets better? I certainly agree with his point that the outrage about the brutality could play a factor, could play a role. So give me your quick answer, and then we'll go to Kian to close. We can't hear you, Amos. You're muted.
I get the fact that people say Iran is not Egypt and it's not Syria and so on. But when the protest started in Syria, we were told that Syria is not Egypt and it's not Libya because it's a largely secular state, which it was and is. So, and Iraq was not the same. It's always true. The countries are not like other countries. It is still with boots on the ground in Iraq, we were not able to turn it into the society into a different direction. That was with over 100,000 troops on the ground and a coalition. The idea that we can do, and comparing this to Venezuela, that is in our backyard, where we can permanently have a military force that is right there, and within minutes we can be there. The security forces in Iran know that we are very far away. We are vulnerable in the region because we have a lot of bases and a lot of positions that are not easy to protect from our perspective. And so I just caution from those who tell us that it's going to be fine. Just take out the leadership and everything's going to be great. Iran is as Kian said, a very large country, not just population-wise, but geographically, with a lot of different borders that are fairly porous and people pouring in and out. And so the outcomes are very dangerous, especially with an American public that has zero interest in a military adventure that goes on for more than a couple of days of airstrikes. That they're willing to contain. Nothing beyond that. And this president is not going to support anything beyond that. And so I think we have a lot more work to do before we get to this regime change. We do not have a good intelligence with the protesters or with other political movements. We don't have the relationship with the IRGC or with other areas where we can create some change. So there has to be a lot more work done. The reason that Israel is able to exercise their dominance, which I agree with Mark on, is because October 7 has been every mistake that Iran can make since October 7. The April ballistic missile and drone attack against Israel that the United States was able to defeat, followed by the next one in October, also led to the demise of their entire missile defense capability, which is what enabled the 12-day war. So 12-day war didn't come out of nowhere. We're in a 2-year decline of the Iranian might in the region, but it doesn't mean that they've lost the cohesion. I come back, the idea that the military can just kill 5,000, whether it's 5,000 or 20,000, there was no breakdown of the regime main components. And so I think that we can do some things, but we have to be careful not to try to do something too aggressive too fast.
Thanks, Amos. This has been an extraordinary conversation. We can feel all the levels of complexity, but we can also feel all of the options and different forks and spokes that this can take. Kian, last word. If you were advising Iranian freedom fighters who want to live in a different country how best to get ready. You've got 30 seconds. Go. And then thanks to all of you.
Very quickly, I know we're running out of time. First of all, it's very important to understand that with all the cautions, which I agree with Amos has said about the country falling into chaos, and I can't describe it, I can't explain it, but I've written an article called Democracy. Iran is more ready for democracy than many people think. And that's not because of ideas, but because of a vast institutional structure which has been built over the years, but has been abused and corrupted by this regime, but that can be used to fill what would have otherwise been a vacuum in Iran. That's something that is important to keep in mind. And so what protesters should also focus on is that they should work with exiled and imprisoned reformists who know how to run the country. And finally, I think for the outside world, I would just say, many people, there are a lot of rumors about outside forces, for example, Israeli or intelligence, that has created these protests inside of Iran. It is obviously cannot be true. If Israel could have made 5,000 people or 20,000 people go into the street and destroy all the missiles, it could have toppled the regime very easily. So I think that people should realize that there is both strong institutional potential and indigenous desire for a future, but it has to be done in a very judicious way from the outside. Thank you very much.
Well, good advice, good cautions from all of you. And I think we can all agree that the people of Iran deserve better, that we will all live in a safer world if they can achieve it, and that there are plenty of tools at all of our disposal to help hasten that, but many complexities as well. Thank you, Kian. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Amos. And thank you to everybody for tuning in. We appreciate you.